BIOS protected passwords. How do we get around them? Well, the CMOS is holding that password in memory in most cases. So what we can do is we can yank the battery out. The battery is going to be attached to the motherboard and those buffers where the password is stored. You remove the battery, you wait 30 minutes, replace the battery back into it, boom. Go back to the default password database that we talked about previously. Now, some manufacturers have backup power to the CMOS chipset, so they're using capacitors. So now what you have to do is you have to wait for that capacitance to leak away, and that usually takes about 24 hours. The problem is that some CMOS batteries, they're soldered into the motherboard. Take a look here. On the left-hand side, it's soldered in. So if you look there, I'm going to pick up my mouse here, and you'll notice that this right here is actually a battery underneath of this soldered piece. Well, you better be good at soldering to get that thing out of there. Otherwise, you're never going to relieve the password. What we really want is this thing over here on the right-hand side. We want a removable, and that little tiny piece on the end plugs into the motherboard. That little white hook plugs into the motherboard. We want one of these. That's kind of the goal, because then we can go, we can remove that right from the motherboard, and that voids that out, and now you've gotten past the BIOS password. Now, with a couple of the newer tools that are out there, there is actually encryption on the motherboard that stops you from inserting new devices, and that may make that more complex, but that's some manufacturers, not all manufacturers. Let's talk about the application layer for a second. We talked about the physical layer. Now let's talk about the application layer. And I said it at the very beginning. I said LCOM Soft Password Recovery. Now that is expensive. Minimum buy-in for that is $600, I think, to get the one that actually uses multiple GPUs for password cracking on most applications that are out there. We're talking about $1,700 for an individual organization. Okay, it's the best at standard password brute forcing and guessing, and it has lots of OS support so that you can actually do 5 or 6 GPUs in a box. Remember, I don't know if I told you all this, but Tesla, if you look up the Tesla card from NVIDIA, it has over 500 GPUs in it. So we use all of that horsepower in password guessing. LCOM wrote to the NVIDIA specification so they can use one Tesla card with 500 GPUs, or if your box can handle it, up to 16. That's a lot of raw processing power doing all that guessing for you on that particular application. Costs you some money for your Tesla cards, costs you some money to build up this box, but if password guessing is a big part of your forensics practice, there you go. Actually, if you look on our website, we actually have that very process. We say, if you need password cracking in less than 24 hours for applications, here it is. Windows authentication. Switching gears here a little bit. We have to understand where the password is stored, because what we want to do as forensics investigators, if it's not encrypted, if it's not encrypted at the hardware level and it's just encrypted at the operating system level, we want to reach into the registry and we want to yank out that password hash. Remember, it's not the password itself, it's the password hash. So we go into the security accounts manager file. It could be an Active Directory. If it's Active Directory, all bets are off. That's an entirely different thing. But as forensics investigators, if we're going into Active Directory, that means we're in a large enterprise. If we're in a large enterprise, there is key escrowing so we can actually get into those accounts. So Active Directory, different game. We play that game by going through the corporate resources. So SAM account, it's located in system root, system32 config folder. It just says SAM on it. You saw this in our registry discussion. It exists inside the registry hive, and we dig down into it and we actually pull that extraction out. We've talked about using Kane to actually do that for us once we've gotten to that particular SAM file. In Active Directory, it is a database. It's a large database located in the system root NTDS, that's NT Directory Services directory, and that's where that file, the password would be in that file. Don't mess around with the Active Directory database. There are plenty of key escrow ways to get into those passwords. Let's talk Windows authentication here about hashing the password, because we need to look at that for the different authentication mechanisms that are happening locally. So remember, in the hash algorithm, what we say is we're going to call it a hash function. It's a one-way function. And remember that two different passwords encrypted with the same, that result in the same hash is very unlikely. It's called a collision. It's possible, but it's unlikely. The password is passing the hash, and that's what we're doing, is our password algorithm says, here's this hash. Because locally on the workstation, we key in password, and it says, well, I don't want to pass that in clear text. I've got this protected mechanism here that I'll hash that and then pass that across. If you're doing attacks in Metasploit as a penetration tester, there are a few attacks called pass the hash, because that's what we wanted to do. We convince the machine to transmit that information, that hash value, to the authentication database. And what we do with those passing the hash algorithms is we insert ourselves into the channel so that it does that automatic mechanism of passing it, and we pick up that password and pull it out. Once we do that, then we take it to a rainbow table. We go through, we find our password right there. Remember, this is stored, this hash value is stored in lieu of the password itself. Now, at the beginning of this, what we do is we do enrollment. How do we get the hash created? So user selects the password, the system calculates the password hash, and then that's stored in the SAM. So as a forensics investigator, when would we create a password? If we're thinking about the adversary at this point, when would they create a password? Well, when they install the operating system. So if we can get a backup old copy of the operating system, or like shadow volume information, we may be able to retrieve the password from a different location. So you've got to be thinking, okay, when was the password first created and have they changed it? Remember, for end users, it's unlikely that they're going to be changing their password on a regular basis unless they are truly adversarial and they understand the technology like we do. Remember, after we do the enrollment, now we're doing the authentication. And all these steps that we see along the way for authentication, as a forensics examiner, these are opportunities for that file to be written somewhere that we can pick up within all of the evidence that we have at our disposal. So user offers the password. Could be that we say, before we get the warrant, since this person is so sneaky, hey, I know that I want to get a hold of Dean, so what I'm going to do is, I know that Dean knows a little bit about security, so what we're going to do is we're going to do surveillance on Dean first. We'll sit outside his office with a telephoto lens, and we'll zoom in and we'll watch what he keys in on the password. And he's got to do that every day because he's got to authenticate every single day. Or maybe we watch him and we see that when he offers the password, he logs in at the beginning of the day, and then he does his ritual run, or he does a bike ride, and he comes back to sit down at the terminal. When would you do the covert search and seizure? After they've keyed in the password. So that could be a part of the planning mechanism for the investigation to get there after they've authenticated and convince them to come to the front door. Candy Graham, I'd like to go ahead and give you this pizza or whatever it is, and we've got them at the front door, and that's when we come in. Remember, the local system password passes the password to the hash function. That's local, not Active Directory. And then the authentication comparison happens. We could use Metasploit on this workstation, even though we are changing the workstation and attacking the workstation, and that's kind of reducing our admissibility in a court of law. But if that's all you've got and you've got no other way to do it, you might want to insert malware at that point to pull across, but you've really got to know your malware. I suggest it as a last-ditch mechanism. I don't suggest it as a normal part of processing as a forensics investigator. So the authentication is compared, and then yes, the authentication passes, we're into the system. No, the authentication fails. So in the authentication process, look at the pieces along the way to actually getting from keyed it in to the other end. We could, in some cases, do a keylogger. It may be appropriate in certain situations. You as a forensics investigator want the evidence. They, as an adversary, want to protect the evidence. What can you do to get it? you could act like a hacker. And that's the whole purpose to the Certified Hacking Forensics Investigator for the EC Council is use all the tools at your command to get the information that you need to prosecute.